So while Darwin's is the most famous figure associated with the theory of evolution, Alfred Russel Wallace played a key part and deserves huge credit, both for his ideas and for his enormous effort. And in their day, this was referred to as the Darwin-Wallace theory. And what's uncanny is when you look at the writings of each of these individuals, Darwin's notebooks, Wallace's draft manuscript, they use the same language. They describe life as, quote, a struggle for existence. Exactly the same words, unbeknownst to each other. I'm Sean B. Carroll, evolutionary biologist and author of several books, including my most recent, a series of fortunate events, chance and the making of the planet, life, and you.
The Untold Story of Alfred Russel Wallace.
So about 15 years ago, on a visit to the University of Cambridge, I happened to visit the archives there, where they hold a lot of original materials from Darwin. And to my astonishment, they brought out and placed into these sweaty hands a copy of one of the early manuscripts that many years later would be modified into The Origin of Species. After Darwin got back from his voyage, he was pondering these ideas and he decided to write them down in essay form. And by 1844, he completed a 230-page essay that fleshed out a lot of his basic ideas. He wouldn't publish anything on evolution for 15 years. That essay, I think, was lost for decades and found under the steps of his house. So when it was presented to me, all over the manuscript, including on the back pages, there were drawings by Darwin's kids. They had been using it like scrap paper. It was a spine-tingling moment for me because this was really the birth of one of the biggest ideas humans have ever had. And I'm grateful that they found it under the stairway at Darwin's house. So while Darwin's is the most famous figure associated with the theory of evolution, Alfred Russel Wallace played a key part and deserves huge credit, both for his ideas and for his enormous effort. So really important to understand that the prevailing idea at the time, to which Darwin subscribed and most British scientists subscribed, was what we'll call special creation, or the theory of special creation. And that was the idea that every species was specially created by God and sort of placed, or at least emerged, in the habitat or in the place on the globe that best suited it. Now, what started to shake that theory in Darwin's mind and in Wallace's mind was in the course of their journeys, particularly when they visited archipelagos, strings of islands. Each of them observed species on different islands that were slightly different from one another. Now, Darwin, and this is just a twist of his story, after nearly 5 years at sea and having made a full voyage around the world, they were about to turn from the southern tip of Africa back up to Europe. But his captain, who was sort of obsessive, decided he wanted to do some more measurements in South America, so he went back across the Atlantic. And Darwin was at first just crestfallen that he wasn't headed home, but he needed to make good use of that time. And he started to take his notebooks out and review what he had seen, but also sort of annotate them. And he thought back to the Galapagos Islands, and he thought back to these mockingbirds that he had seen on different islands. And he saw that on different islands, the mockingbirds were slightly different from one another in their feather patterns and things like that. And he thought these islands were within sight of one another, just 50 or 60 miles away from one another. If a creator was placing species sort of perfectly adapted to each place, why would these mockingbirds be just slightly different from one another? Now, Wallace's story is more dramatic because Wallace, after 4 years in the Amazon, really at the breaking point, decided to return to England with specimens and whatever ideas he had collected. And on his way home, his ship caught fire. He had to get into a lifeboat. The ship sank right in front of him with all of his specimens. And he was in an open lifeboat for 10 days, hoping to be picked up. And he was picked up. Eventually made his way back to England. You'd think after that experience, he would have sworn off all voyaging. But 2 years later, he goes back out and does an 8-year voyage across the Malay Archipelago and collects tens of thousands of more specimens. He noticed, for example, that bird-winged butterflies, these beautiful, incredibly brilliantly colored large butterflies, were slightly different from island to island. they both thought, in the theory of special creation, these islands all looked alike. Why would there be just slightly different species island to island? And it struck both of them because species could change. Species weren't stable. They weren't immutable, as the theory of special creation argued. They, in fact, changed. And this opened up the big question then, or at least the daring question of, are species the product of natural processes or divinely created? And they thought this was strong evidence that species change naturally. They change according to the conditions they encounter in different places. And the islands were crucial sort of laboratories for understanding this, because the volcanic islands of the Galapagos look very similar to one another, but the creatures were a bit different. The islands of the Malay Archipelago, very similar foliage and all that, but the creatures were a little bit different. And the only way they could sort of reconcile that was to say, well, the species were changing. They weren't fixed. They weren't immutable. And as they worked further, they thought about some other patterns. They knew about fossils. In fact, Darwin discovered some really interesting fossils on the coast of Argentina. And through correspondence back home, while he was at sea, he realized these were sort of larger versions of animals that lived in South America at the time. So he found, for example, giant ground sloths, huge, like 8 feet tall ground sloths, much larger than the living ones. But he realized, those are extinct creatures. What's the relationship between the extinct and the living? And he's starting to think about that genealogy between the extinct and the living. And Wallace is also becoming aware of these fossils, because he's reading now what's coming out from the first studies of fossils in Britain in the first part of the 19th century. They had also each read this work by an economist, Thomas Malthus. And Malthus emphasized that there were limits on populations. He thought about the growth of populations. And Malthus said that, disease and famine, that limited, for example, the growth of populations. Well, Darwin and Wallace, being out of nature, they understood that life was very tough. They understood that really life was a battlefield, a contest, and that far more young are produced than can survive to adulthood. And what's uncanny is when you look at the writings of each of these individuals, Darwin's notebooks, Wallace's draft manuscript, they use the same language. They describe life as, quote, a struggle for existence. Exactly the same words, unbeknownst to each other. And they talk about variations, however slight, and that they could be favored. And that led Darwin to coin the word natural selection. They'll be selected for in nature. And the things that are disadvantaged will be selected against. And Wallace said essentially the same thing, that one can imagine if there's a slight advantage, that slight advantage will be passed on generation after generation. So Darwin, for 20 years, is back home in England. He's well known because right after he did the voyage on the Beagle, he wrote a book that we call today The Voyage of the Beagle. And it was a popular read. It's a great read. It's still a great read today about his travels. And he was an eminent naturalist. Wallace was an unknown. He was from far more modest upbringing, and he was really paying his way on his voyages by selling a fraction of the specimens that he was collecting. So he was thousands and thousands of miles away from the center of science in England, and he wasn't connected really at all. So Wallace, by 1858, has a pretty good idea that life changes, life evolves. And he writes up a very short account of his thinking about how that works. And he decides to send it to the one naturalist with whom he struck up a correspondence who he thinks might appreciate it. He sends it to Charles Darwin. Well, this event rocks Darwin because Darwin has not gone public with his theory of evolution. And now here's this faraway correspondent, 7,000 miles away from England, who in just a few pages has essentially the same idea that Darwin has, that Darwin's labored on for about 20 years. Well, Darwin's friends rally and decide that the best thing to do would be to read Wallace's paper and an excerpt from Darwin's work in front of a British scientific society to sort of put both of these ideas out in the public. Darwin wasn't there. It turns out Darwin had suffered tragedy. He was burying his Charles Jr., one of his sons, on the day this paper was read. And Wallace was 7,000 miles away, didn't even know it was going on. It really didn't make much of a splash. Not much attention was paid. But the next year is when Darwin published on the origin of species, and that's when everyone paid attention. The response and acceptance or rejection, particularly to Darwin's Origin of Species, because that's the book everybody could put their hands on. It sold out in its first printing. It was reprinted quickly. It was translated into other languages. American versions were made. So people who are interested in science, biology, natural history around the world could get their hands on Darwin's ideas. So the reactions were a very wide spectrum. Thomas Huxley, who was one of Darwin's close confidants, sort of thought, wow, why didn't I think of that? He thought it was, compelling and sort of obvious. But I think one thing to appreciate with Darwin is that his book is extraordinary in that he also presents and analyzes the critiques of his own theory. I mean, imagine that. This is just something that human beings don't generally do. If they've got an idea, they're going to put out all the evidence in favor of their idea, and they're usually not going to present to the opposition all the evidence either against it or all the evidence that's missing. But Darwin did this in a masterful way, and basically often saying things like, if a particular thing was found, it could crush my theory. Or if my theory is true, this would be true, but there wouldn't necessarily be any evidence weighing on that. So it was a masterful presentation. And I think it made it very accessible to people. They understood the strengths and weaknesses of the theory. And then new discoveries could be interpreted in light of that theory. And as some new discoveries, particularly from the fossil record, came to light, well, that gave a lot of power to Darwin, because Darwin, at the time Origin of Species was published, the fossil record was pretty skimpy. But Darwin made some really strong predictions about what should be found, for example, in the fossil record. And one of those was transitional forms. If the tree of life has evolved in the way that he said, there should be forms that are intermediate between existing forms today. And 2 years after the Origin of Species, a fossil called Archaeopteryx, which has got mixed characteristics of both birds and reptiles, was discovered. And I mean, you couldn't have drawn anything better than that fossil for supporting Darwin's theory. So I think the reception of the scientific community, some of it at first was, positive, but there were long holdouts. There were career-long holdouts against Darwin among even very eminent natural historians, biologists, and scientists. And that holdout was really for reasons we'd all recognize today. While Darwin in 1859, didn't comment directly on the evolution of humans, he did later in 1871, everyone knew that humans were going to be a touchy subject, because for at least a couple millennia, the thinking was that, man was created in God's image, not descended from some previous animal forms. But clearly Darwin's theory would be interpreted to say that no, humans, just like every other animal, evolved their anatomy and their physiology from pre-existing forms. And some scientists held out on that point, both perhaps from their own viewpoint of faith, but also I think because of some pressures in the academy. Darwin was on the short list to be knighted when the Origin of Species came out. Well, he never got that knighthood. So, this was an idea that many people found repulsive. They were really worried about the societal implications to sort of take the creator out of the immediate picture of sort of, tending to human affairs. And that's, of course, still a struggle that exists to today. And scientists, being part of society, it was not universally, accepted. Far from it. Where Wallace really finally grasped the scope of what Darwin had been working and thinking was in 1859, when The Origin of Species was published. And he received a copy of The Origin of Species. And he read it and reread it. In fact, Wallace's own copy is in the Natural History Museum in London, so we can understand sort of his reactions in real time. But I think one of the most poignant things I know in the history of science was Wallace's put his thoughts and reactions in a letter to his close friend and confidant, Henry Walter Bates, with whom he had first traveled to the Amazon. And Wallace is just gushing with admiration for Darwin. And he says, I never, given any amount of time, I could have never come up with something as massive and compelling as Darwin. And he said, I don't think any branch of science has ever been created by an individual such as this, such as Darwin. So Wallace was in awe of Darwin's synthesis, which was the origin of species, but they were mutually generous to each other. Darwin, right off on page 1, acknowledges Wallace and Wallace's ideas. And Wallace later, for example, when he writes his first major book, he dedicates it to Darwin. They are, mutual admirers to the point where, for example, Wallace is going to be a pallbearer at Darwin's funeral. And in their day, this was referred to as the Darwin-Wallace theory. It's only later that biologists and historians just started kind of forgetting about Wallace and crediting Darwin. Now, there might be reasons for that. Darwin came from a wealthy family. The University of Cambridge did a great job at sort of amassing Darwin's collections and Darwin's writings. And so we just have a better historical record of everything that Darwin did. But at the time, it was the Darwin-Wallace theory. And I think by today's scientific standards, given the genesis of this theory, the theory certainly of natural selection by the two individuals, we would be crediting both of them. And it's just the unfortunate sort of, accidents of time that people kept talking about Darwin and Wallace sort of faded to the background. But I really feel in the last 25 years or so that Wallace has seen sort of a renaissance and that people are much more aware of Wallace's huge contributions. And then Wallace outlived Darwin by 30 years. So he was a really important figure in the discussion of evolution because, this was a brand new science. It had relatively few advocates at the beginning, certainly people that really understood it well. And so Wallace played a huge role in getting people to help understand these ideas. I think if Darwin and Wallace were alive today, they would be so overjoyed by the detail with which we understand the process that they first figured out. They knew variation was important. They knew variation was the fuel of the evolutionary process, had no idea how that variation arose. Now, any biologist can point right to the DNA in a newly hatched creature and say, there's the mutation, that's what's going to make the difference. That's a long way from the Beagle voyage of 160 years ago. But that's fundamentally where Darwin and Wallace have brought us.
Want to support the channel? Join the Big Think members community where you get access to videos early, ad-free.